The year was 1863, and the rose garden bloomed with more than just flowers. Beneath the carefully tended soil lay secrets that would shake the very foundations of the presidency's 16 Confederate spies, who had died not in battle, but at the hands of the very men sworn to protect. Abraham Lincoln. This isn't the sanitized version of Civil War history they teach in schools. This isn't about noble battles and heroic sacrifices. This is about the darkest chapter of Lincoln's presidency, when the line between protection and murder became so blurred that even the president himself couldn't see where one ended and the other began. What you're about to discover has been buried for over 160 years, hidden beneath layers of official denials, destroyed documents, and the carefully crafted mythology of American heroism, because the truth is far more disturbing than any Confederate propaganda ever imagined. Abraham Lincoln's own bodyguards became executioners, and the White House grounds became their killing field. If you think you know the real story of Lincoln's presidency, prepare to have everything you believed shattered. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to reveal will change forever how you see the most revered president in American history. The Shadow, WARN. The spring of 1863. Washington, D.C. was a city under siege from within. Confederate spies had infiltrated every level of government, from cabinet meetings to military strategy sessions. The famous Rose O'Neal Greenhound had already been caught and imprisoned, but her arrest had only revealed the tip of an iceberg of Confederate intelligence operations that threatened to tear the Union apart from the inside. But what historians don't tell you is that Lincoln's response went far beyond normal counterintelligence operations. Faced with an enemy that fought in shadows and struck from within, the president authorized measures that would have horrified the very people who elected him. The man responsible for implementing these measures was Captain David Parker, commander of Lincoln's personal guard detachment. Parker wasn't like the other Union officers who served with honor and distinction. He was a former Pinkerton detective who had learned his trade in the brutal world of industrial espionage, where information was extracted by any means necessary, and loose ends were permanently eliminated. Parker had been handpicked by Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, specifically because of his reputation for ruthlessness. In the dangerous world of wartime Washington, Stanton believed that conventional military protocols were inadequate to protect the president from the sophisticated espionage networks that the Confederacy had established throughout the capital. Neither Lincoln nor Stanton fully understood was that they had unleashed a monster who would interpret his mandate to protect the president by any means necessary, in ways that would haunt the White House for generations. The first Fiskey killing began on a warm evening in May 1863, when Parker's men arrested a young woman named Catherine Miller. Outside the White House grounds, Miller had been working as a seamstress in the Treasury Department, where she had access to sensitive financial documents that detailed the Union's war funding. Unknown to her supervisors, she had been photographing these documents with a small camera hidden in her sewing kit and passing the images to Confederate agents through an elaborate network of dead drops throughout Washington. Parker's counterintelligence operation had been tracking Miller for weeks, building a comprehensive case against her that included physical evidence, witness testimony, and intercepted communications with Confederate handlers. Under normal circumstances, she would have been arrested, tried by a military tribunal, and either imprisoned or executed, according to established procedures for dealing with enemy spies. But Parker had other plans for Catherine Miller. Instead of turning her over to military authorities, Parker brought Miller to a secure room in the White House basement for enhanced interrogation. What happened in that room over the next 3 days would establish a pattern of brutality that would claim 15 more lives over the following months, according to fragmentary records that would later surface. Parker subjected Miller to torture, techniques that he had learned during his years as a private detective, breaking up labor strikes. She was deprived of sleep, food, and water. She was subjected to physical and psychological abuse, designed to break her will and force her to reveal everything she knew about Confederate intelligence operations. But Miller, despite her youth and apparent fragility, proved remarkably resistant to Parker's methods. Even under extreme duress, she refused to provide information that would compromise other Confederate agents or reveal the full extent of the spy network she belonged to. That's when Parker decided that dead spies tell no tales and that Catherine Miller would serve as an example to others who might consider betraying the Union. The execution, PRO-20COL, the night of May 18, 1863. Parker and two of his most trusted subordinates, Sergeant Thomas Walsh and Corporal James Morrison, took Catherine Miller to the Rose Garden under cover of darkness. The choice of location was deliberate and symbolic. The Rose Garden represented the peaceful, civilized face of the presidency, a place where foreign dignitaries walked with Lincoln, and where the First Lady entertained distinguished guests. By using this space for executions, Parker was sending a message that nowhere in the capital was safe for Confederate agents. The method of execution was equally calculated. Rather than using firearms, which might attract attention or leave ballistic evidence, Parker's men strangled Miller with a silk cord that left minimal physical evidence of the cause of death. But the most horrific aspect of Miller's execution was what happened afterward. Instead of disposing of the body through conventional means, Parker ordered it to be buried in a shallow grave beneath the Rose Garden's prize-winning roses. The location was marked with a small metal stake driven deep into the earth, creating a macabre map of murder that only Parker and his men could read. The official record of Catherine Miller's disappearance listed her as absent, without leave from her Treasury Department position. No investigation was conducted, no search was mounted, and no questions were asked about the sudden vanishing of a young woman who had been considered reliable and conscientious by her supervisors. Catherine Miller had become the first victim of what would become known among Parker's men as the Rose Garden Protocol, a euphemism for the systematic murder of Confederate spies that would claim 15 more lives over the next 8 months. This is where the story transforms from espionage thriller to horror story, where the good guys become the monsters and the White House becomes a house of death. If you're not already subscribed, hit that button now, because what comes next will show you just how deep this conspiracy reached into the highest levels of American government. The expanding OPRTON boldened by the success of his first execution, Parker began expanding the Rose Garden Protocol to include a wider range of targets. The second victim was Dr. Marcus Reed, a prominent Washington physician who had been treating wounded Union soldiers at Walter Reed Hospital, while secretly passing medical intelligence to Confederate agents. Reed's access to casualty reports, troop movements, and strategic planning sessions made him a valuable asset to the Confederacy and a high priority target for Parker's elimination program. Reed's execution in June 1863 was more elaborate than Miller's simple strangulation. Parker had developed a taste for psychological torture that reflected his growing sense of absolute power over his victims' lives and deaths. Reed was kidnapped from his home on a Sunday evening and brought to the White House basement for interrogation. For 5 days, Parker subjected the doctor to increasingly brutal torture, demanding information about his Confederate contacts and the full extent of medical intelligence he had provided to the enemy. When Reed finally broke and provided a detailed confession of his espionage activities, Parker didn't release him or turn him over to military authorities. Instead, he used Reed's confession to identify and target additional Confederate agents, while planning the doctor's execution as the second addition to his underground cemetery. Reed was strangled in the Rose Garden on June 23, 1863, and buried alongside Catherine Miller beneath the carefully tended flower beds. Like Miller, his disappearance was officially attributed to personal reasons that had led him to abandon his medical practice and leave Washington without notice. The presidential K.O. DG. The most disturbing aspect of the Rose Garden murders is the extent to which Abraham Lincoln himself may have been aware of Parker's activities. Declassified documents that emerged in the 1960s suggest that Lincoln received regular briefings from Parker about counterintelligence operations, including vague references to permanent solutions for particularly dangerous Confederate agents. While there is no direct evidence that Lincoln explicitly authorized the executions, his failure to investigate the sudden disappearance of suspected spies suggests either willful ignorance or tacit approval of Parker's methods. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had originally selected Parker for his ruthless reputation, appears to have been more directly involved in the cover-up. Stanton's personal correspondence, discovered in the 1950s, includes several references to the need for decisive action against Confederate infiltrators and praise for Parker's innovative approaches to counterintelligence work. Most damning of all is a coded telegram from Stanton to Parker, dated July 15, 1863, which appears to authorize the expansion of extrajudicial operations against enemy agents. The garden continues to bloom under your careful cultivation. Plant as many flowers as necessary to ensure a beautiful spring. The telegram's floral metaphors barely disguised its true meaning. Stanton was giving Parker carte blanche to murder as many Confederate spies as he deemed necessary to protect the Lincoln administration. The mass GRV by the fall of 1863. The Rose Garden had become a killing field, disguised as a symbol of presidential tranquility. Parker's operation had evolved into a sophisticated death machine that could identify, capture, interrogate, execute, and bury Confederate agents with assembly line efficiency. His team had grown to include 6 men who specialized in different aspects of the murder process: surveillance experts who tracked suspected spies, interrogation specialists who extracted information through torture, and disposal experts who buried bodies in carefully mapped locations throughout the Rose Garden. The third victim was Maria Santos, a Mexican woman who worked as a cleaning lady in the War Department and had been selling information about troop deployments to Confederate agents operating along the Texas border. The fourth was Benjamin Hayes, a telegrapher who had been intercepting and copying sensitive military communications for transmission to Confederate intelligence networks. The fifth was Rebecca Thompson, a socialite who used her connections to Washington's political elite to gather intelligence. At dinner parties and social gatherings, one by one, suspected Confederate agents disappeared from their homes, their jobs, their lives, only to reappear as corpses beneath the roses that bloomed outside Lincoln's bedroom window. By December 1863, 16 people had been murdered and buried in what had become the White House's secret cemetery. Men, women, young and old, all united by their alleged disloyalty to the Union and their permanent residence 6 feet beneath the symbol of American democracy. The investigation begins. The systematic disappearance of suspected Confederate agents might have continued indefinitely if not for the persistence of Margaret Hayes, the sister of the murdered telegrapher Benjamin Hayes. Margaret had refused to accept the official explanation that her brother had simply abandoned his job and left Washington without notice. She knew Benjamin better than anyone, and she knew he would never have left without saying goodbye or explaining his reasons. Working with limited resources but unlimited determination, Margaret began her own investigation into her brother's disappearance. She interviewed his co-workers, traced his movements on the day he vanished, and slowly began to piece together a pattern that connected his disappearance to a wider network of missing persons. Margaret's breakthrough came when she discovered that all of the missing persons had been under surveillance by the same group of men in the weeks before their disappearances. Through careful observation and discreet inquiries, she identified these men as members of Lincoln's personal guard unit, under the command of Captain David Parker. But Margaret's most shocking discovery was yet to come. Through a contact in the White House gardening staff, she learned that the Rose Garden had been the site of extensive nighttime digging activities throughout 1863, always conducted under armed guard, and always followed by the planting of new rose bushes. When Margaret attempted to bring her findings to the attention of military authorities, she discovered that Parker's influence reached far beyond his official position. Her complaints were dismissed, her evidence was confiscated, and she was warned that continuing her investigation would result in serious consequences for her and her family. But Margaret Hayes was not easily intimidated. If official channels wouldn't listen to her, she would find other ways to expose the truth about her brother's murder and the systematic killing that had turned the White House into a slaughterhouse. We're reaching the climax of this incredible conspiracy, the moment when one woman's determination to find her brother threatens to bring down the entire murderous operation. Subscribe now and comment below if you believe ordinary citizens have the power to expose government crimes, no matter how powerful the perpetrators might be. The WHISTLIBOR Margaret Hayes' opportunity for justice came from an unexpected source. Corporal James Morrison, one of Parker's own executioners who had begun to suffer from severe psychological trauma as a result of his participation in the murders. Morrison had initially joined Parker's unit, believing he was serving his country by eliminating dangerous enemy agents. But as the body count mounted and the victims included increasingly questionable targets, including several people whose only crime appeared to be having Southern accents or Confederate relatives, Morrison began to question the morality and legality of the Rose Garden Protocol. The breaking point came with the murder of Sarah Patterson, a 19-year-old seamstress who had been executed based on nothing more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence. Patterson's terrified pleas for mercy as she was strangled in the Rose Garden haunted Morrison's dreams and finally shattered his ability to rationalize his participation in Parker's killing spree. In January 1864, Morrison made contact with Margaret Hayes through intermediaries and agreed to provide her with detailed information about the Rose Garden murders in exchange for her promise to help him seek immunity from prosecution. Morrison's testimony was devastating. He provided Margaret with names, dates, locations, and methods of execution for all 16 victims. He drew detailed maps showing where each body had been buried in the Rose Garden. Most importantly, he provided documentary evidence, Parker's written orders, and Stanton's coded telegrams that proved the murders had been authorized at the highest levels of government. Armed with Morrison's testimony and supporting evidence, Margaret Hayes faced a critical decision: how to expose a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the Lincoln administration without being silenced or eliminated herself. The EXPOSURE Margaret Hayes solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than approaching government officials who might be compromised or intimidated, she took her story directly to the press, working with a sympathetic journalist at the Washington Star. Margaret orchestrated a coordinated media campaign that would make it impossible for the government to suppress the truth about the Rose Garden murders. On March 15, 1864, the Washington Star published a front-page expose titled "The White House Garden of Death" that detailed the systematic murder of 16 Confederate spies by Lincoln's personal guard. The story included Morrison's testimony, documentary evidence of government authorization for the killings, and detailed maps showing the location of buried bodies in the Rose Garden. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours of the newspaper's publication, crowds of angry citizens had gathered outside the White House demanding answers about the murders that had been committed, literally in the president's backyard. Other newspapers across the country picked up the story, and within days the Rose Garden murders had become a national scandal that threatened to destroy Lincoln's presidency and potentially alter the outcome of the Civil War. But the government's response was swift and ruthless. Within 48 hours of the story's publication, the Washington Star's offices were raided by federal agents. Its printing presses were seized, and its editors were arrested on charges of disseminating information harmful to the war effort. Margaret Hayes herself was taken into custody on trumped-up charges of conspiracy to aid the enemy, and held incommunicado in a military prison, where she could not speak to other journalists or investigators. The cover-up Lincoln administration's response to the Rose Garden scandal revealed the full extent of its willingness to suppress inconvenient truths in the name of wartime security. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton personally oversaw a comprehensive cover-up operation that included the destruction of physical evidence, the intimidation of potential witnesses, and the systematic discrediting of anyone who attempted to investigate the murders. The Rose Garden itself was completely excavated under cover of darkness, with any human remains being removed and disposed of at unknown locations. The garden was then replanted with new soil and flowers, eliminating any physical evidence that murders had taken place on. White House grounds. Captain David Parker was quietly transferred to a remote posting in the Dakota Territory, where he died under mysterious circumstances less than a year later, officially from pneumonia, though some sources suggest he was eliminated to prevent him from revealing what he knew about government authorization for the murders. Corporal James Morrison, the whistleblower whose testimony had exposed the conspiracy, was found dead in his military prison cell, just 2 weeks after providing his statement to Margaret Hayes. The death was officially ruled as suicide, but the circumstances strongly suggested murder. Most tragically, Margaret Hayes herself died in military custody before she could be released or brought to trial. Prison officials claimed she had succumbed to typhoid fever, but her family was denied access to her body and prohibited from conducting an independent medical examination. The historical BURAL, the cover-up of the Rose Garden murders, was so thorough and systematic that, within a decade, most evidence of the scandal had been erased from official records and public memory. Government archives were purged of documents related to the case. Newspaper files were confiscated or destroyed. Witnesses were intimidated into silence or eliminated entirely. The few historians who stumbled across references to the murders in the 1870s and 1880s were told that the entire story had been Confederate propaganda designed to discredit Lincoln's administration. Those who persisted in investigating were threatened with prosecution or found themselves unable to access the archives and resources necessary to continue their research. By the early 20th century, the Rose Garden murders had been so successfully buried that most Civil War scholars had never heard of them, and those who had dismissed them as unsubstantiated rumors or wartime propaganda. The 16 Confederate spies who had been murdered by Lincoln's Guard were forgotten victims of a scandal that had been erased from history. Their names were never recorded on memorial monuments, Their families never received acknowledgement of their sacrifice, and their deaths were never investigated or prosecuted. But secrets this dark have a way of surfacing, especially when they involve crimes committed at the heart of American democracy. The modern-day covert with the truth about the Rose Garden murders finally began to emerge in the 1960s, when renovations of the White House grounds uncovered physical evidence that had been missed during the original cover-up. During routine landscaping work in preparation for Jacqueline Kennedy's famous restoration of the Rose Garden construction, workers discovered fragments of human bone and teeth buried approximately 6 feet beneath the surface of the garden. Initial tests conducted by the Smithsonian Institution confirmed that the remains were human and dated to the mid-19th century. More detailed analysis revealed that the bones showed evidence of violent death, specifically damage to the hyoid bone consistent with strangulation. The discovery prompted a discreet investigation by the FBI, which uncovered additional evidence supporting the basic facts of Margaret Hayes' Yusuf. Declassified documents from the investigation, released in the 1990s under the Freedom of Information Act, confirmed that at least 16 people had been murdered and buried in the Rose Garden during Lincoln's presidency. But the full extent of government involvement in the murders and the systematic cover-up that followed remains classified to this day. The continuing CONSPI today, more than 160 years after the Rose Garden murders, the U.S. government continues to suppress information about the case. Requests for declassification of documents related to the murders are routinely denied on grounds of national security and protection of ongoing investigations. Researchers who attempt to access relevant archives are told that the materials they seek have been mislaid or destroyed in accordance with standard retention policies. Most disturbing of all, the current Rose Garden shows no sign that it was once the site of systematic murder. No memorial marks the location where 16 people were strangled and buried. No historical marker acknowledges the crimes that were committed there. No official recognition has ever been given to the victims or their families. The Rose Garden continues to serve as a symbol of presidential power and American democracy, blooming with flowers that grow in soil that was once soaked with the blood of murder victims. Tourists walk through the garden every day, posing for photographs and admiring the carefully maintained flower beds, with no idea that they are standing on what was once a mass grave. This is where we have to ask ourselves the hardest questions of all. How many other government crimes are hidden beneath symbols of freedom and democracy? How many other victims are buried beneath the beautiful facades of American power? If this story has opened your eyes to the dark secrets that lurk behind official histories, subscribe to this channel and share this video with everyone you need, because the only way these buried truths survive is if people like you refuse to let them stay buried. The ongoing Ion VSDJ2 and BISIT official efforts to suppress the truth. Independent researchers and journalists continue to investigate the Rose Garden murders and their cover-up. In 2019, a group of investigative journalists, using ground-penetrating radar technology, detected what appeared to be unmarked graves in several locations around the White House grounds, including areas that had never been officially acknowledged as burial sites. Their requests to conduct more detailed archaeological investigations have been denied by the Secret Service on security grounds. But the preliminary findings suggest that the Rose Garden murders may have been just one part of a larger pattern of extrajudicial killings that occurred throughout the Lincoln administration. Civil rights organizations have filed multiple lawsuits, demanding the release of classified documents related to the case, and calling for official acknowledgement of the crimes that were committed. These efforts have been consistently blocked by claims of executive privilege and national security exemptions. Most significantly, DNA testing of the bone fragments discovered in the 1960s has confirmed that they belonged to at least 8 different individuals, providing scientific evidence that multiple murders did indeed take place in the Rose Garden during the Civil War era. The moral Ariseco and ing the Rose Garden murders force us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history and the lengths to which even revered leaders will go to protect their political interests. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator, the president who preserved the Union and freed the slaves. But the evidence suggests that he was also willing to authorize or ignore the systematic murder of suspected enemy agents, turning his own residence into a killing field. The case raises profound questions about the nature of wartime leadership and the moral compromises that democratic societies make in the name of security. At what point does the protection of democracy justify the abandonment of democratic principles? When does counterintelligence become mass murder? Perhaps most troubling of all, the Rose Garden murders reveal how easily governments can erase inconvenient truths from the historical record when those truths threaten established narratives about national heroes and founding principles. The 16th Confederate spies who died in the Rose Garden were not innocent victims, they were enemy agents working to destroy the United States during its greatest crisis. But they were also human beings who deserved trials, not executions. They deserved justice, not secret graves beneath the president's flowers. Their murders and the subsequent cover-up represent a betrayal of the very principles that Lincoln claimed to be defending in the Civil War. The man who spoke so eloquently about government of the people, by the people, for the people presided over an administration that was willing to murder people and bury them in secret to protect its political interests. The legacy of CLNC. The most damning aspect of the Rose Garden murders is not the original crime, but the continuing conspiracy to hide it from the American people. For over 160 years, the US government has maintained an elaborate cover-up that has denied justice to the victims, deceived the public about the true nature of Lincoln's presidency, and corrupted our understanding of Civil War history. Every president since Lincoln has had the opportunity to acknowledge these crimes and provide some measure of justice to the victims and their families. Every president has chosen to maintain the cover-up instead. Every tour guide who leads visitors through the Rose Garden, without mentioning its bloody history, is participating in the ongoing deception. Every history textbook that presents Lincoln as a flawless hero without acknowledging his administration's capacity for murder is contributing to the conspiracy of silence. The Rose Garden murders remind us that even our most cherished symbols and revered leaders can hide dark secrets. They force us to question official narratives and demand transparency from our government, even when that transparency reveals uncomfortable truths about our past. Most importantly, they demonstrate that crimes committed by the powerful will remain hidden only as long as ordinary citizens allow them to remain hidden. The truth emerges only when people are willing to ask difficult questions, challenge official stories, and refuse to accept easy lies. The choice is ours. We can continue to accept the sanitized version of history that powerful institutions want us to believe, or we can demand the truth about what really happened in the Rose Garden during those dark days of 1863. We can honor the 16 victims by acknowledging their murders and demanding justice, or we can allow their killers to be remembered as heroes while their own names are forgotten. The roses still bloom in the White House garden, as beautiful and carefully tended as ever, but beneath their roots lie secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about American democracy and the presidents we trust to protect it. The question is, are we finally ready to dig up the truth, no matter how deeply it's been buried? The 16 victims of the Rose Garden murders are still waiting for justice. Their voices are still calling to us from beneath the flowers, still demanding that their story be told, their deaths be acknowledged, their killers be held accountable. We finally ready to listen.